Now, if Labour wanted evidence to back up its focus on climate, there is plenty of that around, as we've just been hearing. Last week, the temperature right around the world broke records. And the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said this.
The situation we are witnessing now is the demonstration that climate change is out of control.
Out of control, according to the United Nations. Well, Secretary Kerry is with us this morning. Warm welcome to the studio. It's your job as climate envoy to persuade people they have to do more, but the numbers suggest it's not working.
Well, I disagree with that. I think that all around the world, people are captivated by the crisis and deeply, deeply concerned about it. You just had a 66-year-old gentleman going out in the middle of the Wimbledon court and demonstrating and willing to be arrested. There is civil disobedience building in communities around the world. And I think if you listen to the scientists, which not enough people are, the last week they have described as terrifying and as uncharted territory. When you see the risks of what is happening already with global ice melt, with challenges of fires, of mudslides, of heat, people dying from the level of heat, the quality of air. People are dying around the world, in the millions, by the way. About 8 million people a year die from that. And it comes from one thing. This is not complicated. It is the way we have chosen to propel our vehicles, heat our homes, light our factories and businesses. It's the provision of power, burning fossil fuel without capturing the emissions. We have two choices. You either capture the emissions or you don't create them in the first place. And that's the challenge that we face now.
If you think, though, of what's happening in countries like China, where coal mine production is still going up, countries like India, countries who maybe sometimes talked a good game at big international gatherings like COP, the numbers in many cases are still going the wrong way. So why are you failing to persuade people to take the kind of radical action?
Persuading people.
Leaders.
China is a country, a huge country. It's the largest emitter in the world. And we need China to cooperate, and we need to cooperate with China. People are sort of in this standoff, but we can't afford to be, which is why President Biden has just had the Treasury Secretary in China talking about economics, but who also talked about climate. And there will be other visits. And what we're trying to do is change the dynamic between our nations. We are the two largest economies in the world. We are the two largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. We need to work together in a cooperative way. I believe the Chinese are now talking about and thinking about how we can do that. We need to progress that. But President Biden is deeply committed to this endeavor. Tomorrow we are hosting, Grant Shapps, the Secretary of Energy Security and Net Zero, and I are hosting a morning event with a group of philanthropists and CEOs, and we've been very graciously invited to brief President Biden and His Majesty King Charles afterwards about how we can accelerate the deployment of literally trillions of dollars, because it's investment by the private sector that ultimately is going to accelerate this transition.
What about the UK then? I know you take a close interest, and we've talked to you on the programme before about the King's interest in climate change, but the UK, until quite recently, used to boast it was a leader on climate change, and yet recently its own sort of independent adjudicator, the Committee on Climate Change, said actually now the UK was missing targets. I mean, are you disappointed that the UK seems to have softened some of its eagerness to be at the forefront?
I think we have a challenge globally, including in the United States, to get people to move faster. And we are doing, President Biden's trying everything possible, including the Inflation Reduction Act, which has raised some hackles in Europe and various places. But what we're doing is trying to excite, to incentivize the private sector to move faster, and that's happening.
But will you tell the UK to move faster? Because
we're not going to sit there and tell people things. I think that's a kind of diplomacy that doesn't work. I think President Biden looks forward to having conversations. I know he's going to be meeting with the Prime Minister, and I'm sure climate will be a critical component of that conversation, because it has to be. If we don't do this, the disruption to all investment, the disruption to supply chains, the movement in migration of tens of millions of people, if you have food production imploding in Africa, for instance, or the heat that we're now seeing in various parts of the world. People can't work outdoors in that kind of heat. And we're seeing already in every aspect of life, it is now being affected by the climate crisis. But again, I say, this is not something where everybody has to go, oh my God, I don't want to do this because it's scary as hell and because we're not going to live the way we did. No, we will have a better quality of life. Mm-hmm. If you clean up the air, there'll be less people getting cancer, less people with emphysema or heart disease being affected. You'll have incredible health benefits. Mm-hmm. You will have food production and security benefits. You will have obviously the quality of air and climate, mm-hmm. but equally importantly, our economies will flourish. We're seeing unbelievable growth in jobs, unbelievable movement in the job market, moving towards these new jobs. The fastest growing job in America a few years ago was wind turbine technician. Mm-hmm. Third fastest, solar panel distributor.
So there is a lot moving. One area though where we've all seen the importance of energy and energy prices, of course, is what's been happening in Ukraine. And this week, President Biden announced that the US would send cluster bombs to Ukraine to help them in that conflict. Now, as a former Secretary of State, you'd express concern about the impact that those weapons can have on civilians and indiscriminate killing of women and children. Aren't you worried about their use in this conflict?
Well, I think everybody's always going to be worried about how something is used, and I know the president has described this as a very difficult decision, and he's putting constraints on how that can be used. But that's not my bailiwick right now. I'm trying to build consensus around climate, and I'm not getting involved in the various foreign policy and political issues of the day, sometimes as frustrating as that might be.
Do you wish you could say something on it?
No, I'm very comfortable focusing on something that is as threatening and as large a security threat. I just came from Vienna, where I spoke at the OSCE, the European Security Group, 57 countries. And there's a genuine focus on climate as a security issue in every respect: health, food, economies, national security.
And it really touches everything across all of
touches
those
everything.
issues. Secretary
Yes.
Kerry, it's a privilege to have you here in
My
the studio.
privilege to be here.
Interesting to see what happens when President Biden arrives in a few hours' time. Thank you.